Thank you again to Dave Whelan and the Talbot Spy for setting up this partnership with the Talbot County Free Library that gives me the opportunity to speak with writers and poets of note from our area. It's a lot of fun. Today I get to speak with, I'm speaking with Temple Cone, who is just finished being the Poet Laureate for the City of Annapolis. Temple's the award-winning author of 4 books of poetry: Guzzle, That's Singing, The Broken Meadow, and No Loneliness. He's also published 7 chapbooks of poetry. He received his Ph.D. in literature from the University of Wisconsin, an M.F.A. in creative writing from the University of Virginia, an M.A. in creative writing from Hollins, a B.A. in philosophy from Washington and Lee. He is now a professor of English at the U.S. Naval Academy. Pretty impressive resume there, Temple. Thank you very much for being with us, and can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, I think you just gave the the CV. I guess what I could tell you right now is I'm from Virginia and have a sort of long history there, but I've been in Maryland now for quite a number of years, so I'm starting to feel like I've migrated. And well, how about you ask me a question?
Okay, where are you from in Virginia?
Well, I'm from Richmond. That's where I grew up.
Okay.
And then my schooling took me into the western reaches of the state.
Okay. Well, I have another question for you. It's one based upon that resume. You know, I don't just look stupid. I really am. Okay. And I've never known what's the difference between a book of poetry and a chapbook.
Oh no, that's a totally reasonable question. So chapbooks were an more or less 18th century creation, and it just means a cheap book. That's what it's short for. And so they're basically in the publishing industry today, anything under 40 pages and typically kind of in the 30 page range is considered a chapbook. Another way to think about it is it's like half of a full book.
Okay, so your most recent book, well, before I go to that, my next question, I think I know how to pronounce Threnody. I believe I know what Threnody means, but I haven't a clue how to pronounce the title of your most recent chapbook.
So you say it the way you need to. It could be Southrenody or Southrenody.
Okay.
Maybe it depends on where you are, north or south of the Mason-Dixon line. But yeah, that's how you say that one. So that is in fact a chapbook. And
can you tell us what that title is about, or is that meant to be obscure?
No, that's fine. So the idea of a threnody, it's a Greek word, and it means like a wailing song, and it's effectively a dirge. And the book has got a lot of poems in it that are calling up voices. And when I say voices, I don't mean particular people. I mean like the sounds of voices or the tones or the language of different voices that I can recall from growing up where I did. I grew up in Richmond. We also had, we owned a house with my godparents on the Rappahannock River. So my familiarity with a sort of Chesapeake dialect is I won't say that I can reproduce it myself, but it feels like it sort of rumbles around in my thoughts. And so this collection was an effort to sort of retrieve some of those voices, which are really tied closely to the landscape in which they're situated. And then in terms of the emphasis on the threnody, many of the poems in the book are sonnets or versions of sonnets, experiments with sonnets. Which is not a dying form by any means, but I feel as if there's, in contemporary poetry, there is a move towards a kind of experimentalism that pushes away from traditional formalism. And so there's a bit of a threnody there for that. And that's a big generalization. There are plenty of poets who write in form, but I do think that there's an impulse away from it. So those are some of the things that are at play in that title.
Okay, well, that leads nicely to my next request, is that you read one of those poems, and it does speak from a particular interesting point of view that, as a Southerner, I recall very well. I wonder if you'd read for us Axiom of Saturday Nights.
Sure. Yeah, I like this one. All right. Axiom of Saturday Nights. Sometimes a man gets tired of doing for others. Then he sets off looking for some varmint to kill, some woman to dance circles around. He puts on a clean shirt, trims the waning moons from his fingers. There are establishments with such men in mind. When he steps out the truck, the gravel round his boots is rhinestones glittering under house lights. Inside, folks bow their heads as he passes. All can tell a deed is beginning. The air poised like a nameplate on a casket, awaiting engraving.
Unmute. Excellent. Thank you. I always feel funny asking poets about the meaning of things, because I understand. I know that some folks. I try to write prose, and sometimes I don't want to tell people. I want them to think about it. But I certainly detect a hint of menace in that poem. Am I right there?
Yeah, I think so. There is. So I think as early as some of my earliest poems, there's often this sort of edgy threat of some kind of violence, and the natural world as it emerges in my poems is a world that has a lot of violence in it, and I'm not revering it. It's just a kind of realism. My experience with nature is not just of a kind of romantic tranquility, and I feel as if there's a little bit of that in that Southern demeanor, that as much as it might be full of chivalry and pleasantry, there's the potential for some kind of menace, but there are also things that channel it or harness it or keep it from becoming dangerous. And I feel as if the poise at the end of that poem, the way everything's sort of hanging on what will happen next, is both, it's the Hemingway's Grace Under Pressure, right? It's both the pressure and the grace. And of course, that's a phrase that he uses to talk about the bullfight, which is obviously full of menace, but also of art.
Death in the Afternoon. When people ask, speaking of violence and menace and all those terrific loaded words, when people ask you, as I'm sure they must from time to time, what need have America's fighting men and women for poetry? How do you respond to that?
Well, I think I can give you some generalizations that usually work with parents of students who are considering majoring in English. Like, leaders need to be able to communicate. I think my experience working at the Navy, being close to a number of officers, is that it's the issues that the military faces are not technical issues. The issues they face are human issues. They are political, social, and cultural issues. And the closer you are to actual acts of violence, the more you need to be comfortable with ambiguity, uncertainty. This is Keats's negative capability, right? It's the capacity to be in the midst of uncertainties without grasping after explanations. It's a paraphrase there, but I think one thing that poems can do for us is to help us become accustomed to uncertainty and doubt. Or the positive version of that is a kind of openness that comes with linguistic play. They also, quite frankly, they settle people down. Poems refuse easy, transparent communication. Even the most lucid poems still make us work for them. And I think at this moment, my students are barraged by emails. Emails don't deserve a second read. They usually don't deserve a first read. Poems make us slow down and become accustomed to things. And I feel as if there's an image in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Early on in the novel, the narrator is talking about a prize fight that he watched. And he says that one of the men fighting was a real boxer, and he sort of had mastery of all sorts of shots. But the other man, who was a bigger, stronger man, who was getting wailed away upon by this boxer, I think Ellison writes, he stepped inside the man's time and kind of came in under him and knocked him out. And I think that sense of being able to change one's experience of time is one that's at play in poems. And I think that it's one that can give people, I don't want to talk about advantages, but it can help them negotiate the world in ways that, the popular discourse doesn't really support.
Sounds good. I'll bet you're an excellent teacher. And does teaching poetry affect your writing of poetry?
Well, it has a little bit of a when I say negative, I don't mean to put this in terrible terms, but it's hard to breathe out and breathe in. And I feel as if, I think when I'm teaching, it can be a little harder to write because a lot of energy is being diverted in those different directions. But I think one thing that it's really been good for is that it gives me a chance to read new poems or read old poems anew. And I tell my students this, that I don't necessarily learn a lot of things from them. And I sort of feel like teachers who say that they learn from their students maybe aren't doing their job. We need to come fully prepared. But I will say that the students freshen my way of looking at things. And yeah, I come away from class feeling younger. I always tell them I'm 75.
The years ago when I was at Hollins, I taught several poets, and I taught in the elementary schools there a poetry course, and we worked from a text by Kenneth Koch. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. Wishes, Lies, and Dreams.
Yep.
Yeah, you know it. Okay, good.
Oh, yeah.
That has taught me more about poetry. That simple little book. And it, and what it does for children, I think, and the access it gives them to poetic thought, I really like it.
I love Koch's principle in that, of course, is to get the students to, they obviously have to read some poems, and what they read is real poetry. They read poems by William Blake, and then to imitate them. And in that sense in which, at that moment, that the students then get a little tradition that they can embellish upon. And children have such delightfully weird ways of looking at the world that you give them some kind of container, what they pour into it is going to be miraculous. If you don't have a container, though, it just goes everywhere and is a mess.
Sure. Yeah. How is the Academy dealing with COVID-19?
Best it can. At the moment, as we enter the semester, the spring semester, midway through, around the time of spring break, we shifted to all online instruction, which had mixed results. I think my class went pretty well, and I think that's because mine is a discussion-based class. So having conversations like the one we're having, whether it's in person or online, can be done. It's more fun in person, and you can get more people bouncing off of each other quickly without speaking over each other. As we go into the fall, we will have a period of time where we're online, and then we're going to try to have some version of in-person classes. It's a little worrisome what it's going to do to the students' education. I do think that the humanities stand to come out better off than the technical classes. I couldn't imagine taking a mechanical engineering class in this, because I think that the students need their teachers right there doing the hands-on work with them. Because in an English class, you have a text and you talk about it. we could even pull it off by phone if we needed to, or by correspondence. So I think the students will do okay. I think the hardest group will be the plebes, the first year students.
Yeah.
Because if this is their sense of normalcy, this is not a good normal for them.
Yeah, no kidding. From reading your poetry, I gathered that you're a fan of Robinson Jeffers, Randall Jarrell, and James Wright, among others. And I know you've written about 20th century American poets. Can you recommend a few for us?
Oh, sure. Jeffers, it's funny you mentioned that. Jeffers was the focus of my dissertation. Yeah, he was a poet. When I was at Washington and Lee, the first creative writing class I ever took, just as a senior, was with a woman named Claudia Emerson, who at the time was an adjunct with no books to her name or anything of the sort. And I remember that I made an appointment with the president of the university, and sat down with him to tell him that he needed to hire her permanently as a professor. They didn't, and she went on to win the Pulitzer Prize. And her one of the last things that we talked about when I was a student there, she gave me a poem by Jeffers called "The Deer Lay Down Their Bones," and she gifted it to me. She said, "This poem is yours," and that sort of stuck with me for quite some time. Of recent poets, I have to shift right now. I'm teaching a senior seminar this fall on haiku poetry, and so that's where all my reading has gone. I have to, if you'll let me look back at my bookshelf for a second.
Sure.
So of living poets, a poet I really love is Forrest Gander. Forrest won the Pulitzer Prize last year, and he has a marvelous book called Science and Steepleflower. But he's from our area of Virginia. He's good friends with Sally Mann, who lives in Lexington. Some other poets to recommend, and here you've got a poet who died a few years ago, but Seamus Heaney. I think poets, readers who want to come to a poet who has some challenge, but who is also accessible and is deeply musical, but also engaged with political realities. Seamus Heaney is a poet to go with. There we go. Got to look back there.
Yeah, I've got Heaney's Scaffolding on the wall over my.
Oh my God! What a marvelous poem.
Okay.
But my professor from UVA, Charles Wright, would be somebody I'd recommend. Not for people maybe the first time out trying poetry, if only because his poems engage with so many other poets. But I also, when I was there, I studied with Greg Orr and Rita Dove, and I think either of them would be for people who want to read recent poets. They'd be ones to look at, and then maybe some younger poets. Sandra Beasley has a book called "I Am the Jukebox." She's got a poem about a platypus. It's a very funny book. She's got a good sense of humor. A guy named Kevin McFadden, who is a school, has a marvelous book called Hard Scrabble. So anyway, those are a few I'd toss out there for readers.
Oh, those are great. Thank you.
Sure.
And a lot of those I don't know, so I'm looking forward to checking them out.
Well, if folks, if anybody watches this and wants to follow up, my email address, my university email address is online, so they can reach out to me, and I'm happy to push books on people. That's not something I struggle with.
Well, that leads to my next question. You're good at this. I'm the library guy here in town. I work at the Talbot County Free Library, and one of the things I do, because I love poetry, is I do push books, and I'm always pushing poetry on people and trying to convince them to read good poetry. And one thing that I hear again and again from our patrons is that they say, I love prose, and they name all the things that they like to read. But poetry makes me feel stupid. When I read it, I don't understand it, and I don't like feeling stupid, so I don't read poetry anymore. And I have to admit, and I say this to everybody on this program, when I pick up a New Yorker, about half the time I read the poems and I go, I haven't a clue what that's about, and it makes me feel pretty stupid. How do you respond to people who think that way about poetry?
I sympathize completely.
Okay.
I guess what I would say is I think that worry about feeling stupid, about looking stupid, is a legitimate one, and it probably comes out of some bad educational experience somebody had. It's not worth blaming the teachers. I think it's worth blaming the way that maybe they approached poetry in the first place. If all you're concerned with is what a poem means, you're not going to get much out of it. I mean, as I tell my students, if they want me to tell them what Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn means, I will tell them what it means, because that's really a secondary concern. It's how it expresses that meaning, how it puts those ideas together, how it sort of grips us as readers and moves us. Those are the things that matter. And so if I do workshops or anything where I can engage with an audience, I try to emphasize things like reading aloud and just getting down to a kind of a sheer pleasure in what you're reading, and that may make some poems and some poets less viable. Certainly political poets or more politically minded poets might be harder to work with in this vein, because if they've got a political urgency, pleasure may not be the thing they're most interested in. But you mentioned earlier the poet James Wright. Wright's plain spoken but really musically lyrical work is immediately gripping. But when one starts to pick at it to sort of say what it means, it's quite hard, and yet it feels meaningful. And I guess the other thing to say would be, if poems, because they look short, they're similar to other short things like correspondence and emails and things. So we think we're supposed to get them quickly. But if you consider a book of poetry as being somewhat on par with a novel, then you start to see something that is deeply, deeply compacted. And thus, if it were using the analogy of coal, if it were coal, it's been compacted into diamond. And that's going to take a tremendous amount of work to sort of understand fully. And so at a certain level, all you can do is just become accustomed to it. And that's why, for instance, I ask students to memorize poems and read them aloud multiple times in one reading, because it's a way of becoming acquainted. Wittgenstein says, the German philosopher Wittgenstein says, to imagine a language is to imagine a form of life. And I think if we treat poems analogously as living things, it takes time to become acquainted with something, even the simplest things. And I think that's actually part, again, I said this before, that slowing down is part of the great value of poetry, especially at this moment. You can't consume volumes and volumes of it unless you're expertly trained, I suppose. You just have to linger over stuff. And that runs afoul of a lot of values in our culture at the moment. But I think it's a very healthy one.
I agree. And I'm so glad that you ask your students to memorize poems. Yeah. Do you know about the Poetry Out Loud programs? Yeah, where they have high school students memorize poems and then compete with each other as to who's done the best job. I've gotten to judge that a few times around here, and I think it's so good for kids to have that opportunity. Memorization, I try to memorize poetry. Still, I'm not very good at it, but when I memorize a poem or just even take the time to type it into my computer, it's almost as if I were writing it, a second time around, and it gives me a perspective on it I've never had before. I'm glad you're doing that. Keep that up. And then finally, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that practice that you mentioned, writing the poem yourself, I push students to do that, and to sort of say, because once you put it in your own handwriting, or at least if you typed it on your own keys, it is yours. And you can even for a moment fool yourself into thinking that you wrote Gerard Manley Hopkins' The Wind Hover.
Yeah.
And that's a bit of an uplift, and you can't pull that off with War and Peace.
It'd take a while, that's for sure.
Sure.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to begin to come to an end here. But I'd like to close with you reading one more poem, one that I want people watching this to pay attention to your use of dialect in, because it's marvelous. It's Lentacost.
Okay. So this is Lentacost. Y'all fixin' to die in awful ways. Shame you can't see. Bees be helicoptering over clover. Black bears snarl awake. Ginseng fingers up in woods where no one strays. And still y'all sure of what the spring says. Beauty be resurrected, some such thing. Can't see past the pear trees blossoming to the hawk glaring from a stand of hickories. Hunger's what it means. A famine hard on winter's heels. No berries yet, no calves born. This here wet breeze carries some fool notion that life's looked after. God cares. And yon storm ain't bringing floods, but will raise up new corn and kindle trees with verdant flame. Oh, yes'm.
Oh, that's terrific. I love that. Temple Cone, thank you so much for being with us today. And you got to promise us you'll never, ever stop writing.
Not at all. Thank you so much for having me.